Shalom, everybody, to the Unexpected Cosmology. My name is Noel Joshua Hadley, and I am here tonight with Andrew Hoy. Now, Andrew was on with us, I don't know, I've lost track of time, a couple of months ago. Most of you probably don't know that because we did not air that episode. And some of you were there for it. And now, I'll say this, that it has never happened at any other time before. It was... I had to disregard the whole episode. It's just that everything that could have gone wrong with the tech issues did that night. And at the end of it, Andrew was a perfect gentleman. He did a great job. At the end of it, I felt terrible. I'm like, Andrew, I can't put this on YouTube. I can't put this online. It just, I got knocked off twice. People were getting knocked off in the offline in the comments section, and we were robotic. And I think Andrew had the best signal of everybody present that night. Anyways, here we are again. And for many of you, Andrew needs no introduction whatsoever, but probably for a great many of you, he actually does still. And so I'm going to, before we get into it tonight, and talk about, you can see behind him, his screen, he has a picture of the Tabernacle in the wilderness. That's the topic of the night. And before we get into that, Andrew, tell us any contact information, where people can find a website, Facebook, books, anything like that.
Okay, I'll do that in a second, but I guess I want to just throw out some irony here in that here we're re-recording on what day is the 9th of Av. So the 9th of Av in the Hebrew calendar, the 9th day of the month of Av. This is when all sorts of atrocities have happened throughout history with Israel. So you have that's when the spies came back from the land and said that the land is no good, and that's the thing that really made the father irate to the point saying, okay, well, you're not going in. So they're like, oh, it's a scary place and there's giants there and everything, but it was really saying that the land was no good that made the father say, you're not going in at all. And so that day has been, again, cursed in history. If you look at that, and this is very connected to the temple as well. So here we are, the project's chartered to do Tabernacle research and restoration. And so it's just kind of ironic here that this is, our re-airing is 9th of Av, which is when the first temple was destroyed and the second temple was destroyed. And, a lot of people don't realize that the time apart between the first and second temple destruction, it's so, they say 586 BC and 70 AD. Well, if you recalculate that time span with respect to a 360-day year, which is a prophetic year, Bible prophecy calendar, again, 360 days instead of 365 and a quarter, you get 666 years apart in that span. So other things have happened interesting in this period. 1492, the Spanish Inquisition started on that day. We've got more recently, this is this happened in conjunction with I guess World War I started, kicked off on that day. The Jews also, I think Kristallnacht was on that day, if I'm not mistaken. And then more recently, we've got the Hurricane Katrina in the Gaza Strip. So there's a lot of interesting history on that day. So I just think it's kind of cool that we're reconnecting on that. So
a couple other things, because I was just looking this up. Andrew and I were talking about this earlier, about how when we were throwing out dates to do this reshoot, I just threw out there July 27th. They're just randomly, and I had no clue it was the 9th of Av, and he's looking at it, go, well, that's interesting. Well, a couple other things is that the Simon Bar Kokhba revolt with Hadrian, he actually lost on the 9th of Av in 133. And the following year, Emperor Hadrian, he went in, guys, my theory on the Dome of the Rock is that Hadrian built that. They tell us the Muslims built that, but coincidentally, it is an exact match to the other temple to Baal that Hadrian built in Lebanon. And there is no other dome like that anywhere in the Islamic world. And so I just think that Hadrian built that. But anyways, he actually plowed over the Temple Mount in 134 AD on the 9th of Av. And also another interesting date is you would talk about the Spanish Inquisition, 1492. Also, according to the official narrative, the Jews were expelled from England in 1290 on the 9th of Av. So a couple other things to throw out there. Interesting day. And World War III did not start today that I know of. I don't want to jump the gun because you never really know. We might wake up tomorrow morning and go, oh, it did start. But to my knowledge, it has not started today.
Yes, sir. And what was I going to say on that? So when we do the commandments, this is, I think, the opportunity to reverse the curse. So this is the getting into the project. You were asking before about the project, and so the project is about Tabernacle research and restoration. So first we need to have it thoroughly researched, and then I also believe in the prudence of restoring it by means of models, by means of just in headspace. That's kind of where it all begins. And so that's what the project is founded for, or founded upon. And so for those who are really, really unfamiliar with this, it's called Project 314 because I found more the pi constant in Exodus 26, 7 to 13. If you start looking at the curtains, there's 11 curtains, there's 30 of them, one is folded in half. They measure 30 by 4 cubits. And if you do the math as far as how that is around, that ends up being 315 around. Well, verse 26:13 of Exodus says, take a little from here, a little from there, a cubit. And so I realized like this is a subtracting number with respect to the curtain edge overlap. And so I'm like, oh my, this is 314. This is pi. This is significant. And so I had known about the laver for Solomon's temple was built with the understanding of pi as well. If you look at the calculations of the ID of the bowl, and then the hand span and the basically on the rim thickness and everything like that, it works out to 314. And everyone thinks, you look at King James and it talks about 3 times the diameter of the circle of the relative to the circumference, and they're like, ha, these Bible people don't even know pi, when in fact that turns into 314 as well if you do the math on that. So anyway, this is what the project is about. So if you understand the paradigm shift, the paradigm change, and you understand some of the other details in the hardware and the description, like there's things in English that don't make any sense. Like if you look at it, it says, arrange these boards to the south side southward in English. Well, in Hebrew, it's negba v'tamana, which is towards the south and towards the right, which is clockwise. And so we start to see all these wonderful little details in there that didn't make sense to them before. And so, people think that I'm just, I guess, speculating or something like that. And this design is beyond speculation. Some people have called me creative, and it's like, this is not creativity. This is literalism, thrown in your face here. So that's how we get, this other side here. That's how we get this, and everyone thinks it's been this. The 50 by 100, I get a lot of like, well, it says 50 by 100. They don't realize we're talking radius and diameter here. So that's in a nutshell the discovery.
Yeah. Now, just to make this clear for anyone out there who hasn't caught on yet, this is Andrew's baby. Now, I think like in the world of research today, we're so used to just going on the internet and you discover things on there, and like a lot of researchers just copy and paste, and everyone's kind of borrowing from each other and stuff like that. But if you can be an individual that wants one big discovery in your lifetime that is original, unique, and a huge contribution to the world of research, if you can do that one thing, then you are really lucky. You are really fortunate. And this is, just to make clear to everybody, this is something that Andrew Hoy, like he's not just making this up. He's not just imagining this, nor is he going to, Wikipedia or some, back alley in the internet and just copying and pasting this stuff. And so can you tell us a little, and maybe you kind of just did, but tell us a little bit about the discovery. I would be interested in hearing what actually led you to this, to go, that aha moment where you're like, wait a second, because we've all grew up with this idea. You can see on stage left up here, the rectangular the Tabernacle Wilderness. In fact, I went to a replica of the Tabernacle in the Wilderness back in the 90s. Somebody in Florida, they put one up. It wasn't a full-scale model. It was maybe a quarter. I don't know what it was. But that's what we all grew up with, the rectangular tabernacle. So what actually led you to this discovery?
Yeah, I was working on a book where I was trying to study out cherubim and saying, okay, what is it with these cherubim things? And I was led to Exodus, because the first real mention of cherubim is in Genesis, of course, within the garden, and then the second one is within the tabernacle space. And so, there's the law of first usage as far as words and etymology. Now, if you go and study the word cherubim, lots of luck, because I tell you this, because every Bible in the world, I can tell you right here and now how they have it translated. And you know how that is? It's cherub or cherubim. Cherubim being the plural, cherub being singular. And when you see this in the Bible, they're tipping their hat and confessing that they don't know what it is. And so I started, questioning that whole thing on the word study thing. And I was trying to figure out, because I read this book about, is it Alfred de Gaza or something like that? This guy who was saying that the Ark of the Covenant was some static electricity generator thing. And I'm like looking at that, I'm like, interesting idea, but how does this hold up? And so I started getting kind of intrigued by, it's like, being an engineer, it's like, could this thing be this static electricity generating thing? And in that assessment, I'm thinking, well, you have two curtain types that are dissimilar material, assuming that, you got this goofy shoebox thing. They have a 4-layer roof, which doesn't make any sense from any standpoint. And if you look at these surfaces, you'd have them arguably rubbing over one. Well, if you want to make as much static electricity as you can, you take two dissimilar fabrics and you bump them around and rub them on each other. And this is how you're developing static charge. And so I'm like thinking, okay, we got this amount of area, and as I'm looking at that, I'm realizing that the way that they got these curtains interrelated and staged. There's some people who think that there's gold woven into the curtains, and the threads then somehow go into the Ark of the Covenant. I'm like, okay, well, that's interesting and all, but because it makes sense that have a conductive path or whatever. But it's really this question, I kind of started looking into the generation of electricity, probability or potential with that, and it's like, I concluded that this thing as a static generator was just absurd. And but along the way, it was the cherubim. So getting into the cherubim, I'm looking at the curtains, and it's like, well, everyone has this all different. My dad was an engineering professor, and he used to joke, he'd say FDB with TLC. So TLC is tender love and care, but FDB stood for free body diagram. In other words, just draw out whatever you know on paper, a little sketch, so that you can start to articulate. So I kind of did that exercise, except for I didn't do it on paper. I did it on a spreadsheet. I'm kind of kicking the numbers around, and this is why I realized that the way that they normally stagger all these things is they're joining them all long edge to long edge. And then I kind of looked at the numbers, just kind of glancing in my head. It's like, okay, well, if we're taking this 30, 30, 30, these curtains that are all 30, and you are dividing, you're laying them out, and you're folding it lengthwise, instead of turning into 42, because you had 11 curtains, one folded in half, so you'd have 44 minus 2. In this case, it's 315, because it's 30, or 30 times 11, so 30 times 11 is 330, minus the folded is 15. So I thought, gee, that's close to, the pi constant. And then I saw that next verse of Exodus 26:13, and chill went up my spine. I'm like, oh my word, this is a correction. This is a 1 cubit reduction to take that 315 and to turn it into pi. And so that was the big eureka. And then there's other points along the way where you get in Exodus 27, and it talks about these the shoulders or the flanks of the it describes them as being the gate, but this is again bad translation. And the dimensions of these gate posts, where there was three posts for every 15 for 15 cubit length. And I'm like, well, 15 times 2 is 30. We got these curtains that are 30. So it's like the text is actually starting to talk about your fabrics before it talks about the framing. And so once you realize that that's the game being played, the parts come together different. The language suddenly makes sense. It's all harmony, and it practically builds itself. So.
All right. So now Andrew has a few books here. I'm just going to go over this really quickly because this will go into my next question. And he's not going to be talking about this tonight, but I do want to plug this because this is really a great little read. You can see this right here on the screen, Eat Like Jesus. I think it's backwards on my screen, but whatever. Maybe it's not backwards on Josh's, but where he takes us through the dietary practices of Messiah. This here is
I actually prove kosher all the way back to Genesis 1 in that book in chapter 4 anyway, but I just want to interject that, which is I don't think anyone else has done that, but that's because the Hebrew. So
yeah, and if we have maybe time, I'll ask you a couple questions from there. I just don't want to distract from the tabernacle. And then we have this here, the Exodus Tabernacle 175 scale model kit is simply instructions, and you should see me try to put together IKEA furniture. So there's that. And this here, I don't know if you want me showing this. This is not published, right?
That is technically unpublished because
okay.
Well,
this is. I'll just show you the thickness of this book right here. Okay, and this book right here, I guess he sent me an advanced copy, and I, went and looked through every page on here. And what he does is, I won't show you since it's unpublished.
Break it open to chapter 1 somewhere if you want. It's
break it open to chapter 1. Okay.
We're in chapter 1 and show some chapter 1 pages if you like.
Well, you can see here. This is showing the typical rectangular tabernacle, but what he does here is breaks this down. I'm trying to see here a good page. Well, yeah. Well, we'll just jump on this here. Like you can see here, he goes through step by step, and he's showing you like the circular design. And then what he's going to do is he's going to show the poles going up and over, and basically how amazingly the tabernacle looks like a yurt. If everyone can imagine, like, a Middle Eastern yurt, it looks pretty much like that. And he takes you through every page, just step by step, showing how he came up with the design and how it all plays out. So when you go through it, nobody's thinking, okay, he's just making all this up. Like, as Andrew says, he's an engineer and he's thinking from a technical standpoint, and he's taking you through the instruction manual and putting this together. And when you look at it, it's like, this makes sense. Like this makes total sense. So that being said, what sort of things do you have going on with this project 314, in terms of publications? I showed the model kit, but maybe you could talk about the models and even some of the webinars you were telling me that you put on.
Yeah, I guess starting into the product line. So I apologize, I didn't have copies of the House of El Shaddai, which that's one on Amazon right now. That's like, it's 4.8, 4.9 stars. That's actually the workbook for that.
This one,
that accompanies.
This one right here, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a workbook that accompanies the book. So anyone who's like into homeschooling or Torah study, all that kind of stuff it's a complimentary thing. I got PowerPoint, so you can present this to a group yourself, as well as the PowerPoint kind of doubles as a self-study with guided links. Right now, actually, Kim is on here. So Kim and I are working, revamping this so that we can have this direct on the website. That's kind of one ongoing activity, which is just I'm very excited to see a lot of that stuff, because this is the sound. I hate to have the project as the sound of one hand clapping. This is why I put project314.org is because with the original tabernacle wasn't built or restored by one guy. it's a community effort, and this is, I'm hoping that people who value Torah, want to get back to commandments and everything like that, see this as worthy of being built. But part of it is just understanding it, because everyone is stuck in translation. So again, this is why Kim and I are focused right now on trying to make a study tool that is sensible, agreeable, enjoyable, all those things. So we hope to have that on the online before too long anyway. But so that's kind of an ongoing effort. Other things that are ongoing, I have a 175 scale model, which Noel showed the instruction manual for. So that kit, you can order that from my website right now. I've had some supplier issues with respect to material thicknesses and the like that have caused me some grief. But that's a 40-page instruction manual how to do it. So it's not just like I want to build this in two hours, a Lego kit. I mean, you can get it together in 2 to 3 hours if you're trying to not learn anything along the way. But it's really designed as an interactive, three-dimensional tool. So it turns into a hands-on experience. It becomes a learning tool that you cannot you cannot imagine the difference in you being able to understand the things when you put fingers to materials, because now suddenly the counts matter. It's like, well, why do we have 40 ribs? It's like, why do we have or rib beams? Why do we have 10 curtains here? Why do we have 11 curtains there? And so once you start to see the mechanics of the materials and the measurements and things like that, it's like, oh yeah. So it doesn't seem nearly as speculative, nearly as theoretical, because this thing here is something that is built literally according to the Bible. This thing here, there's all sorts of gaps in interpretation and twists and turns on, it's just some really terrible exegesis, inferences, eisegesis, extrapolations, all that stuff. I mean, it's miserable. You start comparing, all these models, and guess what? They all contradict each other. And everyone thinks it's the same because why? It's a big box. It's like, well, it's a big box. Everyone agrees on that. So everyone thinks that, common truth, shared truth, and majority opinion suddenly makes things right. And it's like, it doesn't work that way. So, so the model is something that's been near and dear to my heart, making this so that, everyday people can build this on their kitchen table. So again, you can order that on the website right now. But I haven't gone into full-blown promo mode, and trying to juggle a number of things here. So another thing that we've done is an 8th scale model, and we did an exhibit of that 8th scale model, which is that's about 7 feet tall and 22 feet in diameter. So 722 is the pi relationship, if we're rounding here, a ratio there. But there's also we are working on planning jigs and fixtures for a quarter scale plus. When I say quarter scale plus, now we're looking at something 50 feet in diameter, and that's really the next stage and step ambitions of the project. So to be able to bring this to Sukkot events and conferences, where you can do a walk-in. I joke about the Ken Ham Ark Encounter thing. On one hand, it is likened unto the days of Noah, one could argue right now. But the other side is like, well, we've been promised we'll never have another flood again. So I kind of joke and say, well, they spent $100 million on a boat that won't float for a flood that won't happen. And so, it is a great witness, the Ark Encounter thing, testifying to like, yeah, this could have happened. This is a for real thing. But the Tabernacle would be, kind of same ballpark, and that's if you're using gold and silver. So, to start to, for us to be bearing witness, this is bearing witness to the Creator, to His house, the way that He wanted it. It's like we build ourselves all these churches. These churches aren't in the Bible. This is the only structure in the Bible that ever says, "Thus saith the Lord." Go build this thing, and build it like this. So that's what I find is very special about this, and why we should endeavor to do progressively more closer to a real scale, real life models. So.
Now, you had mentioned answers in Genesis, and of course, I've been to the Ark out there. And what amazes me, because we're talking about instructions, right? Like you're piecing to this together based on instructions. It amazes me that answers in Genesis and company, right? Say Ken Ham and company, they look at Genesis 6, 7, and they put how many millions? I don't know how many millions of dollars. I think you said 100 million. I don't know if it was
100 million's gone into that place. So yeah.
Okay. And they put all that money into it, and they still couldn't get the details right on the clean and unclean animals. Like they don't tell you that 14 giraffe went into the ark, right? They conveniently look over that point. And that, of course, goes into the whole idea of as you proved back in Genesis, that there were clean and unclean animals way before the Abrahamic or covenant or mounts, shrimp and shellfish didn't suddenly become bottom feeders. They didn't evolve into bottom feeders at Mount Sinai. They were unclean before that. But all right, so you're looking at you said 3 hours to whip up the 75th scale. How long would it take you? Like if you were to take the fourth scale, which is a future project, but you want to take it to Sukkot, how long would that take you to assemble something like that?
Well, when you say you in the personal, the eighth scale, the eighth scale. How would I say this? The eighth scale model, I put that up myself, and I did it incrementally, going around and around, kind of ratcheting things up a layer, and I was basically modeling, because this goes back to, I guess, 2016. There was, when Rob Skiba first had me on, we were talking about this. So a guy was inspired and called and said, "Hey, I'd like to help build a model." And I'm like, "Okay, that'd be great." He's a tool and die guy. I'm all excited, and so I start developing these drawings, which are articulating the detail down to the all the machining details and all. It's just a lot of detail to try to convey to someone else who's doing the fabbing. If I'm not doing the fabbing myself, I got to be explaining a lot more and giving all these specifics. So I get all that together, and he's like, "Well, how'd they put it up?" And I'm like, "What do you mean how they put it up? They just put it up. Just leave me alone." And I'm kind of joking about that, because it took me another, probably took me another 4 or 6 weeks to come up with those plans. And I don't regret the fact that I've done it. It speaks to credibility. It also speaks to, like, there's certain details along the way which are not called out in Exodus that you would need to account for. It's like between having holes for pivot pins or winches and things like that, dealing with the mechanical event. You're putting up a 6-story structure in the middle of the desert with no crane. So how on earth do you get that up? Because it's part of the story, and it's part of the credibility, feasibility study. And so when he challenged me in that, I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to do that. And as I ran through it, I calculated literally how many Levi's you would need to have doing heave ho. How many Levi's do you need on a rope? How many Levi's do you need pushing on a pole or whatever? Because it's part of, they had 22,000 Levites, and how many of these people are mustering up the effort to do the work. So with that, I made a whole detailed lifting plan, showing that this is something that they could have done very easily in a day with a crew of 3,000 to 4,000 guys.
It's a lot of dudes.
It is, and it makes sense once you start seeing, like, later numbers. It's like, anyone who's not a Levite who comes near when they're setting this up shall be put to death. And you're like, oh boy, is that extreme? Oh, they're cruel. But it's like, no, that's not the way to see this. To see it is like, if you got a little joker around putting scorpions and grasshoppers in down people's back, thinking it's funny to. All it takes is a breaking of concentration. Look at the Amish raising barns and stuff like that. They have all the people with their little ant legs, lifting this whole structure and floating it around. It's a similar thing. It's like, once you start to disrupt that process, it could be lethal, fatal for thousands or hundreds of people at least, as all this stuff is collapsing upon them. And in the New Testament, there's reference to Shiloh. It's like, well, when the tower at Shiloh fell, was it because they were evil or whatever? And it's kind of like, that's kind of a no never mind. I think they could have been neglecting it or abusing the tabernacle. I think that could be a tabernacle reference, to be honest, to the collapse of the tabernacle in a state of disrepair, what have you. So that's just speculative on my part. I can't prove that, but I think that's what that's referring to New Testament wise. But
that's fascinating. I never thought about that before. Now, last weekend, I put up a floor to ceiling. So my living room, it's like a double, 2-story to the roof. The living room, it's huge, and I put up a wall bookcase all the way to the top. And it was the same thing. It wasn't like as extreme with my children, like anyone who disturbs their father will die. But it was pretty, I mean, it's like my children weren't catching on, and they had like this video camera out, and they're like getting up in my face, like videotaping, and my wife could see it. And she's like, put down the video camera and step out of the room. Because I was like, I was getting ready to like, say some words I would regret. But I could totally see that, they're trying to put it up as like, just leave them alone. Anyone who disturbs them, Okay. So they're putting this up, and I'm noticing that the height difference, and you had mentioned it's 6 stories tall, which is big. I mean, that's a tall building, 6 stories. I would imagine you could, I don't know if you could see that all the way, because the camp was what, 10 miles wide, or 12, 14. How long would you say the camp was?
That is a reasonable range. You have to start putting numbers to paper at some point with these things. And if I look at if anyone looks at the size of a condo or an apartment, or in this case, you equate it to tent, like, okay, well, if they're living in yurts, let's say they're living in yurts, small, and because after you've been in the wilderness for a number of years, so I don't think it was always arid. This idea of Bamidbar, everyone presents this as if it's desert, Saudi desert, arid. Was the Saudi, area, was it that barren years ago where there was zero wood? There's wood in the hills. There's pine. There's pine species growing in that area. So. Not only would they probably use that for the tabernacle, but for building their own shelters as well. They have flocks and herds, and were they using were they harnessing leather? What did they bring along? At what point were they just sleeping out under the stars versus in shelters? And once they have shelters, like how much room between you and your neighbor? There's the commandment: bake what you're going to bake, boil what you're going to boil, or whatever with respect to the Sabbath, with respect to the manna, right? So if they're all cooking, it's like, well, how many people do you want to have cooking in as far as proximity? There's a lot of camps and fires, and then you get human waste disposal and so forth and so on. So you can start, assuming certain population densities. There's the case in Deuteronomy where I want to say it's the people of the Moabites or whatever. It's like they're like, these people, they look up land like grass, or like the ox, right? So the fact that they get this horde coming through, they're basically probably depleting every resource if they're in higher density. So I think that's very reasonable. If a 5-mile radius or 10-mile diameter or possibly more. If you look at a city, I live near Milwaukee. Milwaukee's 587,000 or so, and if you look at the 3 counties around it, that is, it's 1.5, 2 million or whatever. And if so, that's a really comparable case study. You go down near the lakefront to see fireworks, and everyone just descends on the lake, and you start to get some real equivalence as far as a scale of crowd and people. So yes, well, you start spacing out that far. So
I was trying to envision this, because so when I said like 12 miles, so if the tabernacle is in the center, and with these measurements, like the furthest you would be out is like 6 miles away from it. I mean, if you were like on the outskirts of the overall camp, right? I mean, we're just estimating here. And I'm trying to imagine like how far back you could see this thing, because I'm imagining all these little yurts, hundreds of thousands of these little yurts all around, which makes total sense, right? Because, like if we had all these yurts and all of a sudden we had a rectangle, no, it looks like a giant yurt, and in the center there, how far away you could see this thing. But the question I wanted to ask is because if everyone can look behind Andrew and you see the little rectangular, the box as he calls it, and then the yurt, what's the size difference in height between the two?
Well, this would be 10 cubits tall, because all these boards, which are for the wall, and it's literally there's the way that they interpret those boards, that they use boards that are 3 times heavier than what is used in the actual, because they're inferring 2 dimensions. And when I say 2 dimensions, of course, when you go and buy a 2x4, you're buying a 2x4. Well, is that a stud for a wall, or is that an 8-footer? So is it 92 inches or 90? I'm trying to think between 92 and 96. Or a full 96, whatever. So when we have this this board, these boards, it says it's 10 cubits by 1 1/2. And it's like, oh, do you mean 10 by 1 1/2 or 10 by 1 1/2? Well, they force it into 10 by 1 1/2 to match the rest of their stupid curtain overlay paradigm. And so you get them assuming that this is a fabric wall structure with these big, heavy, thick walls. I mean, if you look at that, well, I shouldn't even say that, because they're still assuming 2 dimensions. So some of them just assume they're boards and planks that are like a couple inches wide, and these are like big panels of wood standing on end, planks of wood standing on end, side by side by side. And then Rashi actually is saying that they're 1 cubit by 1 1/2, or something like that, and it's just enormous. It would make one of these beams, if you're using a 25-inch cubit, make these beams 6,000 pounds. That's 3 tons. So that's like as much as like a fairly heavy car. And I'm saying that they're 3 times lighter because they don't realize that the Hebrew says it's 10 by 1 1/2. So we've got length with height, and this is something that you need that detail to build. There's some things that are only given in 2 dimensions, but the third dimension is then inferred or able to be calculated based on other things. It's a lot of precept upon precept. So this is what they can't understand. They don't understand because they're going with the wrong paradigm. So,
okay, one last thing before I move on to the question on everybody's mind, an observation on everyone's mind probably. But I do want to ask you, because the 75th scale, you mentioned it's 400 pieces in the kit. So if I were to take part, if I were a Levite and I'm building this thing out of the wilderness, assembling, you said like 30,000 people or something, how many pieces would this be to put it together? I mean, just an estimate. I know you probably don't know. It's probably not in front of you. Just if you had an estimate.
No, I've calculated it, and it is in the 400s range.
Okay.
So what I cannot do is scale things infinitely small or infinitely. You can scale things infinitely large, but not infinitely small. In other words, wood grain doesn't scale down perfectly. Neither does fabric, and neither do little gold buttons. So little gold buttons, those are exceptions. So I have them represented by, by graphical, by printout. I do not have 50 little buttons of gold in the kit. These are a few small exceptions, but in general, for the courtyard, if it says there's 11 curtains, I got 11 curtains. If it says that it's 20 posts on the south, 20 on the north, I got 20 on the south, 20 on the north. So I'm trying to be as diligent as I can with respect to replicating the quantities as well as the functions, where I can in that kit. So I hope that.
Okay, so
it's somewhat over 400 and less than 500, as I recall. So
now I want to put a reminder out there to those listening in right now, and I said it before we went live, but if you have any questions for Andrew regarding the Tabernacle, regarding his research, regarding anything historical related to it, please write it in here, and I will be sure to ask him those questions. And for those of you who were here last time, we did a recording that obviously I didn't put online. Some of you would ask questions. If you want to repeat those questions, please write it in again, and I'll be sure to ask them. Now, cosmology, that's the one that comes up a lot. And I'm wondering if you could indulge us more on the cosmological connections, and anything related to how it relates to the Zodiac and so on.
Well, I'll start with Hebrews. So I guess for a point of reference, you'd asked before about products and publications. One of the other things that I have are I do webinar, and so I do that either twice a year or right now I'm kind of looking to try to up that that run frequency. Right now it's a 7-part series. When I say 7 parts, typically the discussions anywhere between an hour and a half and 2 hours. I shouldn't say discussions, the presentations. And from there, we've done, I've had marathon chats after going up to making the whole session, 8 or 9 hours straight. So, getting into the level of material, the quantity, the relevant quantity to be discussed on this, the number of paradigms that this opens up. You mentioned cosmology, but there's human anatomy in this thing like you would not believe. There is Christology, there is numerology, gematria, you got paleo study, all sorts of things. And this is, to some degree, it is, I think, the Rosetta Stone of Bible interpretation in a lot of different things. So a lot of things are being conveyed through this anomaly of a 2-chapter Bible, 2-chapter Bible description, which seems kind of casual. I tell people with respect to the curtains, and it's like, oh, well, who cares that the curtains are 3 colors, and who cares that the curtains have 50 loops and all these things? But it's like there's the idea that there's no idle words in Scripture. I get this a lot of like, what's it matter? What's it matter? And it's like, can you imagine telling that to the Almighty? He says, hey, build me this thing and make it like this, that, and the other thing. Well, I don't think it matters. Is it a salvation issue? This is where it keeps coming back to me. It's like, well, it doesn't matter what the shape is. It only matters that, it says who? It says you? These are people who don't understand that the pashat, the simple of this structure in itself. So I have to, speak to the ridiculousness of those claims and maybe preemptively, to anyone who's listening, who's skeptical and scoffing and saying, shrugging their shoulders, saying there's nothing else to see here. So this isn't one-hit wonder, but
I think you've heard me say before that my least favorite question that I get asked is this a salvation issue? And I've stated in the past that it's like, my answer is, well, everything to me is a salvation issue, everything, because, I mean, you said it really eloquently, but the idea is that if we're claiming that we want to spend an eternity with Mashiach, with Yahushua HaMashiach, as well as our Heavenly Father, it's like, well, what is the Father's 9-to-5 job? What does it look like? What does he do? What is he like? What is his character like? Right? What are the things that are interesting to him? He has these. I don't want to go off topic, but just really quickly, I got really excited yesterday because these Jehovah's Witnesses came to my door and they knocked, and I went out there and I talked to them we had a long, very animated conversation. They loved it, by the way. They're like, I think they were feeling like for the first time they were getting like challenged, and they were like really into it, and I was too. And we were in agreement. Like they were agreeing with me that they don't celebrate birthdays, they don't celebrate holidays, because they're like, this is all pagan. I'm like, awesome. We're all in agreement. It's pagan. But I'm like, okay, so you guys shun this pagan stuff, but did you know that Yahuwah has these 7 holy days that he invented in his mind, that he instructed in Scripture that he wants us to follow? And they just looked at me like dumbstruck. And that's the whole thing, right? It's like, if we want to spend an eternity with him, why aren't we interested in the things that he's interested in? Why do we think that it's okay just to not be interested, and that once we get to heaven, it'll all be different? We'll be interested in it, or Elohim won't care, right? It's like, no, he told us all these details, everything in there. As you said, there's no idle words. It's all in there for a purpose. So I don't want to take your thunder, but that kind of sent me off down that path right there. So
good, and rightfully so.
But yeah, back to you.
I had this presented as far as content. I'd gotten a booth. Someone had sponsored me to go out to ASOR, which is American Society of Oriental Research. These are all the architect geeks, the people who are like thick into the history books and so forth and so on. So I had a booth set up there, And you know who was the most interested of this? It wasn't Jews, the Christians, or the seculars. It was LDS. I got the most interest from them than I did from any other person there, and I thought that was interesting. That they value. And actually, I ran a video on my one of my webinars. It's like a 10-minute testimonial thing, and what is it? It's the LDS kids putting together the shoebox, and they're excited about this, and they're passionate, and they're inspired, and they're seeing this thing come to life, and it's real for them. And these are 12-year-old, 13, 14-year-old kids. A lot of boys that are really engaged, and it's like, well, we weren't men. That we're B'nai Israel. B'nai is from Bana. Bana is build in Hebrew. So this idea of Ben, Benjamin, son of my right hand. We have this Ben concept is that we are builders, and if we are not building things, who and what are we? I think I'm hoping that this will inspire more men to say, hey, let's go and build this. Because again, I've got the plans, I've got the details, and I'm trying to do a crawl, walk, run. My father used to say, if you don't have crawl, walk, run, you have trip, stumble, fall. And so this is why, getting into the stage rollout of first and eighth scale, which is basically a 2x4 size construction, and making that the special ring for it and everything. And the next up, a quarter scale would be, that would be sizable. The roof just shy of 20 feet, and where you could have hundreds of people inside. This is part of the vision, and this is part of why I'm looking for people who are inspired to, again, live out their faith. And people say, "Oh, I keep the feast, I keep the feast, I keep the feast." It's like, well, that's nice, but it's like, how did this go in the wilderness? This is why they were taken out of Egypt. It was like, let my people go so that what? So Yahagu, so they can have a festival to me in the wilderness. It's like, that's why they were taken out, and this why that they were restored to the land. And so this notion of how would I say, Yahagu is the Hebrew there. It's with the root word is Hag in there. So you hear Rob talking about Hug, the circle of the earth type thing. So here we have this notion of the circle in the wilderness. So what do they have in the Arabs, Muslims have the Hajj. Where do you think Hajj comes from? From Hag. Hag Sameach is happy holiday in Hebrew, and for Jews they say Hag Sameach. Is happy, joyful circle is kind of this idea to revolve, to dance around and gyrate. Is the notion behind that. So it's like, well, which is the gyrating thing here or there? So getting into how this is then relating to the you were asking before about this cosmology. So I'm going to start with Hebrews, and I was kind of trying to track down that path, but I got kind of pulled off on the not salvation issue relevant thing. But the book of Hebrews is describing what? It says that the priests serve at this tabernacle, which is a model of that which is in heaven. When have you ever seen anything like this drawn in depictions of heaven? I hereby challenge you. Google search all you want, all the images. You won't find a single picture of heaven that has anything as ridiculous as the shoebox in it. Okay, so this is why this paradigm is suddenly making more sense. Now, we also have, and I'm going to maybe ruffle feathers by saying this. So the occultists, they say, as above, so below. There was a certain guy in the New Testament who said, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So we have the lower and the upper, and you have that reflection in that sense. In this case, we have a camp. The camp has Tzabah of B'nai Israel, the host of heaven. Abraham is just told that your descendants are going to be likened unto what? The stars in the sky, and also the sands of the sea. But the idea that the idea of sea also is very closely related to people. So you have Yam and Am. So Am Israel Chai is people of Israel live. But this idea of the seas, and we see in Revelation the idea of the seas of people, everything. So this sea thing, or this theme of like spanning out, in all which directions. It's speaking of a vastness, but the word Sabah, this host of heaven, Sabah is used of the star or the starry hosts, and getting into this being the lower part. And the lower part is the the sons of Israel scattered about on earth. So I get into this in one of my webinar sessions in some detail, showing how this camp relationship is with Zodiac, I guess. So.
Well, okay. So if the I wanted to touch on the as above, so below thing as well, because that's something I've talked about a lot on here. And as you said, there was that guy, I think he's in the New Testament or whatever, that said, on earth as it is in heaven. And so, that's, as I point out, Yahushua HaMashiach's version of as above, so below, which says on earth as it is in heaven. Well, what's interesting is that there is actual a line in the Ascension of Isaiah, or the Ascension of Yashayahu, where he talks about right below the firmament. So he says that there's 7 different layers of heaven, or different worlds, but right below our firmament. So there's the dome, and he's going up, and he says that's where the prince of what Paul would say, the prince of the power of the air. That's where all the evil ruachoth, the dark spiritual creatures are up there fighting and kind of battling over the fate of the earth. And he uses a line in there. He uses the line which is almost exactly like as above, so below. And I think that that's actually giving it away, that when the occult is talking about as above, so below, and when we get into like Freemasonry and all that kind of stuff, they're talking about they want as above, like the spiritual realm right there, so below, which is very different from on earth as it is in heaven, which is above the firmament. So that's my take. That's my take on it right there. How I separate the two. I classify them separately.
It's a reversal in language. Then you're saying that's
pretty much. So. Yeah. So if everyone could, because I was just thinking about this, because you had said that how it's modeled after the heavens, right, or after heaven. And so you could see right there in his yurt zone, there's like the circular opening there, and I maybe you would agree with this. That's where I would place like the North Star. Perhaps is that where you would place the throne of the Most High, right there in the center? Maybe I'm just throwing that out there.
Yeah, I tend to have issues with the idea of throne. And let me, you want to get my goat, say the word mercy seat.
Well, I don't want to get your goat, so I won't say that.
And so I'm bringing this up as throne. So the word kasah, kasah referring to covering, and that's what I'm doing on this chair. I'm covering this chair. But there's also kippur, and then there's kipporet. So you get into the Holy of Holies, kipporet, and this idea of that which is covering the ark. So if we listen to the, dare I say, the Edenic expression, or the Edenic root, there's a guy named what is it, Isaac Mosen, who writes this. He's a Jew, and he's going through like a lot of languages throughout the world and looking at these roots, the Babel, pre-Babel roots. And so people realize that what they don't realize is we are speaking bits and pieces of Hebrew, but we don't recognize it as such. Ken and can, it's like, well, in Hebrew, ken is usually translated as yes, but it has to do with the establishing something. And so you have can in English. It's like we're speaking of the possibility, the potential of something, right? Yes, I can do that, right? There's an enablement concept, or which is a lot like establishment. Can is denoting possibility as opposed to impossibility. And I bring that up. We have the same thing with Kippur. So Kippur, Yom Kippur, it's a day of covering. And it's, of course, how they translate Day of Atonement. It's like, what on earth is atonement? When's the last time you use it in a sentence? It occurs like 100 times in English Bibles in the Old Testament, but only 1, 2, or 3 times in the New Testament, depending upon what translation you're dinking around with. And when I say dinking around, it's like, because we're trying to use the New Testament to define what atonement is and means. But we're not even considering what Kippur is, and so they're masking this idea of a covering, and pulling it away. So this is getting into the same problem with the mercy seat. So it's assumed that if the Almighty is sitting on this thing, there's this seat. How would I say this? It's assumed that it's a chair, and if you look at, I guess we have a case of the Ark of the Covenant is like, it's thought of as like, oh, we're carrying a chair. And if you look at royalty, how they carried around, on poles, and it's literally a seat that they were carrying. And so I think there's that sort of thing by a combination of pagans and cruel monarchs and so forth, and say, okay, I'm a god now, elevate me and do it in this capacity. So I think a lot of the thinking then, becomes, defined by misrepresentation and abuse, and this idea of the covering on top of the, on this, it's more, covering as opposed to chair, which is the seat. And again, the Hebrew word sit comes, Breshit. There's a guy named Seth. So Seth has to do with sit and sitting, and you can hear again all these the meaning of all these Hebrew words spilling out into modern English, and we don't even know it anymore. And so, but they'll translate using words that sound completely dissimilar, and so it leaves us all batty and confused and everything. Again, I'm very opposed to English Bible exegesis for these reasons. Anyways, you get into a lot of dead ends, and this is part of how I was able to decipher this. It's like, okay, I have to surrender this English. You brought up the Eat Like Jesus Bible, or not book. I had to rewrite that thing so many times, and from where I started, it was embarrassing if I look back to, it's like, and that's kind of a rough draft thing too, right? So I'm going into this, not knowing, and I'm sure you can relate, as you start to research, it's like, well, you have an understanding impression, and then you get it thorough, and it's like, okay, now I got to make a course correction and go back. I had to re-edit that thing so many times. That took 7 years as far as before when I started it and when I ended it, because it's like, oh, okay, I got to redo this. And all my redos were because I was using translations. We have, for example, the idea of ceremonially clean and ceremonially unclean. It's like there's no adjective plugged into there. Same way there's no word mercy next to seat, where they're thinking it says mercy seat. So why is it that we're calling it the mercy seat? There's no mercy there. I'm not saying there's no mercy, in the divine sense, but there's no mercy word in the text. You could, chen is the idea of mercy. It's not there, but they want to do a write-in, and it's like, this is why I say I get really, really disturbed by this sort of, language, breakdown. But, and thinking of the cosmology side, whether you are a baller or a flat person, the dome makes sense so much more in both ways, because if you're standing inside of it and you got the sunlight shining, what do you see? You see, patches of light flickering through. It's like, from our perspective, as we're standing on this dirt that we're standing on, you look around 360 degrees. It looks like this. It doesn't look like this. Again, I don't, regardless of where people are on their cosmology. And same thing within the Zodiac going around. So, the Zodiac, there's one guy who pointed out that Zodiac meant Zudi arc, and so arc having to do with an arch, or this is back into the Hebrew again. You have the word orech. So orech is where we get our English word arc from, and it has to do with a measure of time, distance, or space, and that the fact that it can be a straight line, or it can be something arched. And so this is another case where the etymology, we have archery and architect and architecture and arches and I'm thinking of other trying to think of other arch-based words. The archdiocese, it's all speaking of time, measurements, length, either flat or curved, as far as distances. So this is, again, the etymology is everything. So
you mentioned the Zodiac. Does the Tabernacle, the model you've come up with, play out with the Zodiac in any way?
That's an excellent question. I went nuts for a couple of years. Every now and again, I would try to reconcile and force fit. Now, if you start looking at Israel populations for example, so there's a Chuck Missler model where they take the shoebox and say, look, we got Judah on the east side and this many tribes, and then on the north side is Dan, and the south is Reuben, and west is Ephraim, right?
They make the Tav, right? The cross.
Right. It makes a cross, and it's like, well, look, this is testifying to Messiah. It's like, okay, you're correct, and it testifies to Messiah, but your interpretation with the cross is abysmal, because no camp would lay out like that. It's like everyone wants to be front and center. Try to go into a movie theater and suggest to people that that's how they're supposed to sit. That they'll sit in accordance to their threshold of comfort on their ears, etc. And people will swarm around the same way insects will swarm around. So this is just the core basics of human.
I always used to kind of snicker at the idea that when I would see, I think you said Chuck Missler, I guess maybe he was the first one to come up with that, I don't know, but the idea of the Tav or the cross, right, where you have all the different tribes coming out this way, the ones that went in the front, the ones that went in the back, and I was trying to imagine this military formation, like these guys with sticks, making sure they're all in a straight line, and marching through and it's like I won't say there's no way, but I always used to find that a little bit funny. And so that was one of the things I thought of when I looked at your model, and I go, that makes more sense. You see the people kind of all, big circular around it, right? The people on the side, people in the front, people in the back, but it wasn't this military formation. It was almost like in the when you see the Exodus movies, like the Ten Commandments, I guess, but they're all coming out of Egypt, and you just see this long line of them, just coming out with their cattle and their carts and everything, walking out. So,
well, it's like the way that they'll do campus layouts. If you've got an architect who knows how to do grounds planning and everything. Students will walk through the grass and over the bushes and all that. If this is the closest way, straight line. So if they don't make sidewalks paved in accordance with, human, the fact that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, if you're not acknowledging that in the capacity of grounds layout, you're in trouble. Back into the Zodiac thing and. So in some cases, if you start looking at population, so I started looking at population relative to, dare I say, angular displacement or occupation, whatever. So this is a circular thing. You have 360 degrees in a circle, or you say 2 pi radians if you want to express it in radians or whatever. So you can use a lot of different increments, percents or whatever. So you say, I got 602,000 male adult Israelites. So you can pump that up to 2 million, 3 million, 4 million for your, your children and your wives and your children, whatever. But, how does this, how does this play out? Assuming they're going to have a flat open plain without obstructions here, there, or anywhere. They're going to naturally fall back into their quadrants, and they're going to trend towards equidistant spacing, right? Because why should Judah get more space than Ephraim? It's like you want to start them bickering at each other. It's like, you get as much space as me. Can't have that, right? And And this is why, there's some advantage to being close, but there's responsibility as well. Levi is encircling around it. So think of what? Leviathan. So what is Rachel say? I'm sorry, what does Leah say with respect to bearing the third child? Finally, my husband will be joined to me. Levi is the joiner. And so you've got this the serpent eating its tail. This is the to say of a serpent. Levi is not likened into a serpent, but this idea of a joined organism of sorts, encircled.
I love how I love how you just connected the Ouroboros to the Tabernacle. That's the first I've ever heard that.
Yeah,
Had to throw that in there.
There's plenty more of that. So we have that, and we have this issue of divisions, an idea of division. So Pacuti is the idea of appointments. So what do you have with respect to people? Everyone's appointed unto a certain task in life, or a mission, or a disposition. You got musicians, and you got artists, and you got engineers and mathematicians, and not everyone is appointed to the same thing. You want to talk about a talent for storytelling? Go to Israel and listen to the Jews. They are amazing storytellers. And getting into the media production. So it's like people say, oh, those aren't real Jews in Hollywood, and this and that. And I'm not saying that all of them are ethnically at 100%, or some of them are maybe even fake. I don't know. I'm not going to start spewing out statistics on that, which I don't have. There's only the larger overarching concept. What do we see in the patriarchs? Who is it that took a Canaanite wife? Well, that was Judah. And so they're very strict on. It's like, okay, no intermarriage, and it's like, well, you don't have to be Jewish. You can be Jewish as long as your mother's Jewish and your father doesn't have to be. And so all these points of conflict and confusion, and I'm not trying to resolve all that right here now, but my point is like, Judah is Hodu, is Yehuda. So Yehuda comes from Hodu, and this Todah Rabbah, is this thank you very much. It's thanks, it's praise. So what is Judah really inclined to? Also praise, music. It's like, holy cow, if you listen to Jewish influence in music, and it's really something to be noted. And so it's like the fact that these people are appointed to this praise, the same way that Levi is appointed to what? Encircle and join. They're also getting into the judicial side. And guess what? If you don't have justice, you have a breakdown of relationships, and then people aren't joined together anymore. So the fact that they got this cruel, there's that cursed be their wrath, they're so cruel. This is Simeon and Levi is what Jacob is saying about them, right? But to think that these are not appointed traits as well as appointed, in a sense, expectation. Ephraim is doubly fruitful. He's got the double portion. Is going west. This idea of with the cow, or the bull rather. Parah is Hebrew for that bull. So this, why is the symbol for Ephraim the bull? So you get into all these different things. So there's the divisions in heaven, and there's divisions on earth according with the numbers. So I started looking at that. What's interesting is that there's the courtyard is 42 posts around it, and as far as that circle, so 42. Where else do we hear this, right? Times and a half a time. 30 days. 1,260 days. So 1,260 days is also 3.5 years. Is also what? 42 months. 42. We have how many? Messiah. Messiah is generations. 42. This is the 314 stamp, because when I say 314 stamp, 3 times 14 is 42. So 42 is another expression of a circle. Okay, so we have all these like hints and things like that. And so I was trying to figure out, why is it because if you're drawing this in a CAD, it's so annoying. When I say it's so annoying, 42. If we have a 360-degree base thing, so all the CAD systems you're working in are 360. It's like this is 0, this is 90, this is 180, this is 270. Skateboarders know all that too very well. BMX people, yeah, you just did a 630. It's like, as far as the counting in revolutions, right? So if we count in revolutions and we think in terms of where each of them are in these spaces. If you look at this 42 division thing, it's not a good clear corollary with 360. It's annoying because 42 is 6 times 7. Okay. 7 is a prime number. You cannot reduce it any lower. You can't say, well, like 6 is 2 times 3, right? So I can take the 6 out of a 360 and say, well, 6 times 60 is 360. And so I'm looking at the fraction reduces from 360 over 42 to 60 over 7. So what is 60/7? It's like 8.5, and I'm like plugging this thing into my computer all the time to make these increments of courtyard posts, and then like I'm thoroughly aggravated because it's not a easy to divide and express number. But when you start to look at it, the camp comparisons, right, the Israel camp and the numbers that are given there, suddenly the increments fall in line with the 7. So we got this stamp of perfection, or covenant, which is 7, as far as what that's expressing. Also getting into a revolution in and of itself, 1 day of a week, the week revolves around a 7-day period. So once you start to see how then you could basically be using the courtyard to divide up the tribal increments, and as above, so below, or we'll say as below, so above. What do we have? If the stars are likened unto these creatures down low, then how are the creatures up top? So this is where I think that the Greek zodiac is of lesser importance than the Hebrew. I think the Hebrew zodiac has been staring us in the face, and as we try to reconcile these other things to these other systems, I think that without the paradigm shift, we'll be spinning our wheels, because we're looking at a breakdown of the Greek, which was, to think that the Greeks were had primacy in this realm of, you have the idea of birthstones. That's another thing that comes out of this with respect to the priestly garments, etc. So, but I'm rambling at this point. So
no, that's good. I'm assuming, because you had mentioned earlier gematria, and I'm assuming you were kind of covering a little bit of that there. But when I had brought up cosmology, you had also brought up you brought up a few things, numerical connections. I think you talked about that. You also mentioned, I was taking notes as you were saying it. You also mentioned paleo, but you'd also mentioned earlier anatomical, and yes. So I would love to hear more about. We were talking earlier, and you had mentioned up the human eye, and I'm like, what are you talking about? What do you mean the human? How is the tabernacle connected to the human eye? So I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, there's a lot of language in Hebrew that is very anatomical, and when I say that, we'll go back to paleo, right? So, for those who are not aware, and paleo is kind of a nickname. It's a generalization. It's a little slang-like, and I'm kind of dogmatic in a number of things, and as far as having preference without concrete evidence, because I'm not this history master of any stretch. I'm not going to pretend I've learned a few interesting things that I believe are true, and to say that it's anything beyond belief, I think a lot of times it's affirmed through reason and relationship, as far as the parallels and everything. But I'm not going to, die on a hill over arguments and some of these things. But I just lost my train of thought on that on the paleo. So going back to these paleo letters, right? Half of these paleo letters, paleo is like speaking in terms of dare I say point of origin. So people recognize the Hebrew script, and so whether it's Shabbat Shalom or the sacred name Yod He Vav He, and so some of your audience is familiar with the alphabet that they that modern Judaism is using and so forth. So that goes backwards to this Middle Kingdom period where a lot of people, I think it looks like a YFE type, in this as far as the sacred name, and a lot of that is stuff that you can scribe out by stick or by sharp thing, the same way that we're doing writing, where it's easier to do that than to chisel or to carve something in soft mud or clay rather, and let it bake and cure and turn hard. So the question is what letters lend themselves best to chiseling versus writing and all this. So the aleph, you see the aleph tav, you mentioned the tav before being a cross. It looks like our modern X. And so how did that look in the oldest of the language versus the modern Hebrew tav, right? So they look very different there. But if you look at the aleph, you can see how the modern aleph, which is a awkward letter to draw, came from an ox head, which was also in paleo just shown as, or in some of the paleo forms, like a triangle with a line through it. So if you, maybe I should do that like this. So if a triangle with a line through it, this is like the nose of the ox, right? And then these are his horns. So all of those letters, if you start putting them all together, half of those letters are anatomical in their presentation. Like the hay looks like a torso with arms going up. Let's see, a gimel is like a little walking man a little bit. Or a foot, so the idea of gimel. So we get our English word camel from gimel. And so you've got something that looks kind of like a check mark, like an L, or like a foot, so it's, something walking. So you start looking at all those letters, and, this is something that you'll see in this model as well, of like the spelling of these words takes on the shape of these assemblies. It gets pretty crazy that way, but I guess we're originally talking about the anatomical. So the problem with the shoebox model, this here, is they do not consider that, and they take all these terms which are anatomical and they whitewash them, and they whitewash them to a point of embarrassment and insult. And by that I mean to say, and my apologies in advance to your King James only or King James inspired people. The King James is not inspired in this, and it'll take the word for rib, salah, and translate it as side. It'll take the word pa'e, pa'at, for mouth or getting into like lips. They'll translate that as side. They'll take the word yarach or yarachti, and they'll translate it, guess what, as side. So the word for thigh, the word for mouth, and the word for rib, all of those thigh or side, side, side. Ironically, the Hebrew word sadi is in Exodus 26:13, which is where we get our English word side from. That is one of the 7 different words in this small stretch of text that they translate from side. So they miss other things like head. There's the idea of rosh. There's the eye, the ayin. Our eyeballs, and this is to your original question. Our eyeballs are drawn. There is a letter ayin Hebrew, which it's drawn like a circle, with a dot in the middle. It's just two half. Maybe I should put it like this here, and then a dot in the middle of that. So that is the ion, the letter ion, and this is, where do you think we get our English letter I from? Probably is as far as getting into that drift of language, right? So if you start looking at this right behind me here, what do we have at the top? We have the pupil, right? So you have the pupil, and then the was it Scalia? I'm having a disconnect at moment there, followed by a two-part, the eyelid down below and above, right? So I started to, realize very early on that the anatomical was built into this. And when I started to really kind of bear down and study it, I was going nuts. I was going to go head to toe, and I started on a book on that, and it's like, between trying to get all the images and I'd spend several months, and I came up with like 16 pages of content comparing the eye to the tabernacle to the human eye, as far as the certain similarities. So some of it's in function, some of it's in typology, some of it's in etymology, some of it's in arguably proportions. There's just all sorts of relationships. I go dizzy at this, and this is why I'm looking for other people to help partner with some of this research. Again, Project 314. I have in my logo again, research and restoration. So research is part of this. And guess what? I don't know as much about the eye as an eye doctor. And it's like, do you know how much I want to study the human body? Like, this much. So, I'm hoping that people of religious persuasion, not only just persuasion, people who are passionate, to come and understand the tabernacle, so then they can go and understand what the body. I say the body, in this case the eye, where we can bring out more of these details. Because this side of the research is, when I say it's untapped, I've spent, again, where I got 16 pages of like, hey, look at this, Eureka. But I'm by no means an expert on human eyes and eyesight, and there's a lot of other parallels as well in different things, whether it's head and shoulders and feet and hands and thighs and what else am I thinking? Hair. There's just a bunch of different things that will grab you in the Hebrew if you are paying attention to the Hebrew, and you'll never see it in your King Jimmy. That leads everyone to thinking that it's a 50 by 100 rectangle proportion, which is, anyway.
I tried my hand at being King James only. I had like a stage in my life where, like, I'm going to go King James only, and this was like almost a decade ago at this point. But I tried. I gave it the old college try, and I joined Facebook groups that were King James only, that kind of stuff. I even joined at the beginning of the Flat Earth movement a King James only Flat Earth group, and they're like, Noel, who are you trying to kid? You're not King James only. I was really trying, and I just didn't make the cut. So, okay, so I asked too many questions that you're just not supposed to ask, and that kind of stuff. But the eye part really fascinated me, because if my understanding of anatomy is correct, I think the two most complicated parts of our biological makeup is our brains and our eyes. Now, I could be wrong on that, but definitely our brains are very. But the two things that fascinate me the most about our existence is, one, our consciousness, and the fact that we're here. We're just conscious beings, right? I mean, that just, I was thinking about that today. I'm just like, this is incredible. I was people watching today. I was just out looking at people going, wow, all these people who are walking around and conscious and make these decisions. But the other thing is my eyesight. The fact that I'm talking right now, it doesn't really, I mean, it's like, we all hear the wind, we, sound, stuff like that. But the fact that I can actually see out of, through my consciousness, that's incredible. So I was just kind of curious about that. Now, there's probably other points you want to hit on, and I don't want to distract you from that, but I do want to get to these two questions. And if anybody else has any questions, please ask now, or forever hold your peace, send them in, and I will ask Andrew. So the first one is from Pamela. And Pamela, of course, used to be a worship leader, and so back in her churchianity days, and this is not her question, but I know she was really interested in the idea of the acoustics within the tabernacle, the fluttering and the vibrating. In fact, in your book, you showed like guitar strings, and showing how I'm assuming when they would put the flaps up, that it would be pulled so tight that you would get some nice musical amps in there. But her question was, can you tell the dimensions of the full scale if the tabernacle were erected today? So not your you want to come up with a quarter scale, but if you actually erected the full scale, how much space or land would be needed for something like that? We know you said 6 stories, but how much land?
So these are in when I say relative proportions. So this here and this here. So we got shoebox versus dome, right? So if we're using a football field as a point of reference, this is 2/3 of a football field in the length, this here. And when I say 2/3, I have to add the caveat, getting into the 25-inch cubit. So 25.2 is what I'm using in this. So you've got multiple cubit standards, and the Egyptians were big on this as far as having interchangeability of dimensions in multiple cubits. So you have the royal cubit, you have a sacred cubit, and then you have a common cubit. Common cubit is typically thought to be 18 inches. I want to say that the sacred is the one that's 21 or 20 to 21 inches, and then the royal being 25.2. And I use the royal for a number of reasons, and getting into this issue of dare I say, case study, feasibility study, credibility study, as well as, David Flynn wrote a book called Temple Center of Time, and he brings a lot of interesting things. There's like occultists, I want to say John Dee, he's quoting some of that. But what's interesting is Exodus 25:2 is where we find the Ark of the Covenant. So I'm talking about the idea of Ark, and it's not called the Ark of the Covenant in Hebrew one bit, but it does talk about the orech, the length of this thing. And so where is that? It's 25.2 in Scripture. So the Egyptians had primitive inches, which are almost spot on the inch we use to this day. And if you look at how I used to believe that the Egyptians were, between that correlation with the primitive inch and then also with a foot, there's clear evidence that the ancients were using feet in megaliths in designing their megaliths. So you start looking, it's like, well, why is it we see this conical shaped earth, massive earth formation with a flat plane, round top on it, flat top, and you start looking at all these structures. When I say structures, they weren't even structures. These are earth formations that the ancients left behind. And there's a guy named Carl Monk who's got this video called The Code, and this is something like bad presentation style out of the 80s, out of VHS type thing, but a lot of profound correlation. So he's showing how all these things are expressed in feet, and the math works out if you're understanding the feet, that these are marking the latitude and longitude relative to the Giza pyramid. And so whoever was building the Giza was also aware of all these other places on Earth, and using Giza as the center of this, this grid structure, this geography, measurement tool. Why am I going there? The cubit size. And so I used to believe that the feet were, was an ancient and more ancient thing. Well, I've seen this other thing since, where they're saying the everyone says, oh, metric is based on water, right? And it's like, isn't that great that the weight of something. A liter weighs water weighs a kilogram, and 2.2 pounds, and so forth and so on. But if you look at that, they were saying that I think there's something like K 2017 or 2019 pyramid. There's some YouTube video that gets into the measurements and the metrology of all this stuff. And so one thing is interesting is the Hebrew word for raindrop is meter. It's like, well, what does that sound like? It sounds like meter a lot to me. And so this idea of metering is also the idea of measuring, right? And you got an electric meter on inside your house. And so this idea of the raindrop being foundational to the Egyptian unit measure, and quite possibly still having origins in Hebrew units, if the size of the raindrop of each drop of water is ultimately the same as far as how much it'll be, like 1 centimeter per raindrop is if you drip it out of something like that. So I've kind of shifted my view, saying that actually what we think is the metric system is actually the ancient one, and it's based on water, and it's based on and it seems to be that there's a possible Bible correlation with that. And then the issue of the cubit, then again, what is your cubit standard? What's your reasoning behind that? And that's part of it, that 25.2. So if it's 225.2 inches per cubit, that turns into like 210 or 212 feet diameter as far as, and so a football field is 300 feet long, which is 100 yards, right? So it's 2/3 of a football field is what that's occupying.
All right, so there's a conversation going on right now, and because I had mentioned the acoustics, and Crystal kind of made a comment that I'll kind of turn into a question. She said, "Wow, I haven't thought about acoustics before." And then she said, "You would think that the animal hides would deaden the sound, but the idea is but maybe if it was pulled tight, would it make more like a kind of like a drum?" What are your thoughts on that? Like, when you think about they're pulling these hides up over this great distance, and what is it going to sound like if you're on the inside? If you were to walk in, what can you expect of hundreds of people maybe singing or chanting or so on and so forth?
Yeah, so somebody just typed right, so like a speaker. I had after someone saw the picture of this on Rob's show, it's like I got a text from someone. It's like, wow, that looks just like a speaker. So it's interesting that that's being brought up again. Now the issue of the drum comparison is very it's noteworthy, and it's functionally speaking. So if you're putting together a bookshelf and you're putting that up, unless you're spending a lot of money on a bookshelf, you probably have a real thin membrane on the back. When I say membrane, it's a thin, it's like a really cheap, it's beyond cardboard, but it's not quite wood, right? And on the backing of that bookshelf. Noel, is that what you have?
Okay, well, yeah. So mine is it's actually for vinyl records, so it's actually hollow all the way through. There's no back end, so
Okay.
it's like these boards that go across with these boards that come up like throughout. So I think it's 8x4. That's how tall it is. 8x4.
But it has no backing,
It has no backing.
Right. So if you ever put together a bookshelf that has a backing versus no backing, usually when you have those things laid out on the floor, you can see how they want to twist and flop, right? And that's because shapes that are parallelograms are not stable, right? It's when you have a triangle where it becomes very rigid. And in the absence of that, you could take a square shape that has joints on it that you can try to reinforce all you want, but if you put a flat membrane on the back, that's the equivalence of what we're doing with the tabernacle, and that creates such a stiffness in resistance, because it's like having a cable go from corner to corner. If you got a square and then a cable's going here, cable's going there, and that's why it becomes rigid at that point. Not because the square is a great structural shape as far as its resistance to, because again, a square will become a rhombus or a parallelogram as it's folded, wanting to fold and collapse. But you put a backing on that, with a few simple tacks, and suddenly that thing, it's not going anywhere, right? Same thing with a membrane on this structure. It's like on one hand, you can look at the frame construction, and if you don't have it reinforced with that leather, with that wall, it will not be nearly as rigid. It still is strong enough to stand and do the job. But what that leather adds in its structural, rigidity is to the point where, you could probably hit this thing with a tornado and well, a tornado, but exactly, you get my point, as far as the amount of extra.
You can get quite a windstorm and it's going to hold up.
Right. So the way that it's omnidirectional and its wind resistance, the way that that way that it sheds wind, on one hand, the wind is stronger at the higher elevations, but at the bottom you've got, that courtyard around that buffets the first batch of wind and causes that to go turbulent, where it's more, I want to say more flat. So you get wind and it's coming over, and boom, it kind of hits the wall. Then after that, it keeps on sloping up and curving, right? So that's one side of it. Now, there's also curtains down below with this model, and the curtains then, in Hebrew, there's a word yiriot, yiriot. So yiriah is in the singular, yiriot is in the plural. And the way that the paleo letters match how these things are coming together, again, is a very interesting corollary. But the way that it's translated in Hebrew is like the idea of tremulous hanging is the way that the Hebrew, what it's conveying. And if you look at this idea of ruah, not ruach, with spirit, although there's two letters closeness on that, but you've got the idea of Yom Teruah, which is what? The day of blowing. And so what are you doing with the blowing? It's not just blowing trumpets, it's shouting. It's a day of shouting. And this is where some of the Strong's mappings aren't always the best as far as the Hebrew that it should be relating to. So if you look at Yiriot and you look at the spelling of it, the root is really, I think, more tied into this idea of this ruah, which is what it's ultimately vibration, whether it's a tongue on a trumpet or the vocal cords on the throat, right? So if that's what's making the noise, so on these, you are tensioning those elements all the way around. There, in Hebrew, the way that it's described is ma'asach chashav. Chashav has to do with either weaving and or thinking, because when we're thinking, we're weaving ideas together, right? We're stitching things together. But this chashav, ani choshev, I think, is the chashav is referring to thinking and thoughts. And so these curtains are literally a cunning work, is the way that it's an artistic work. People like to say, oh, isn't that pretty? And it's like, well, let's go before that and say, first, isn't that functional? Isn't that brilliant? And then admire its beauty, which is otherwise arguably much more subjective, right? So if these are a thoughtful work, it took me several weeks to figure out how these curtains really went together. I mean, I got the gist of it, but as far as down to the thread, down to the chords of it all, it took me several weeks to say, well, how is it that these things would really, 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 really be designed? And it's because why? It's a thoughtful work. This is engineered hardware. These curtains are engineered hardware. And I know that if you look at like Art Scroll commentaries, I want to say either Rashi or Ramban, they have nothing to say about the first 13 verses of at least they didn't have it in Art Scroll as far as in print. it's just it's crickets. And why is it crickets? Well, they start on the frame first. It's like, well, the Bible introduces curtains first. And so what do you do when you go camping? You first lay out your fabric. You lay out your tent and say, where am I going to put this? You don't start putting in stakes right away. You don't even start with a frame, right? You lay out your fabric, and then you put your frame inside of that, or work with that. So same thing in the Bible. And we're given, it's technology in wilderness. This is Antiquitech. This is what we got here. And the economy of language is just brilliant. I mean, you start looking at this, and it's like, who could have thought, why does it matter if there's 20 of these and 2 of those and 6 of them? It matters. And then you start putting it all together, and it's just like this is just brilliant. It's like, this isn't my design. This is interpreting that which is brilliant for what it is. And this is part of why I think it's so important to build these things. It's like, this is a testimony. This has been an embarrassment. This is a broken religion right here. It is broken. It is messed up. This is restoring. People want to go back to Torah, and we say, oh, we keep the feast, but a feast consists of what? Like a meeting. You're going to have a meeting with your boss. What do you need? You need your boss. You need you. You need a time, right? You need a date, and you need what? A place. The place where he puts his name. That is the place where he puts his name.
Well,
this idea of name is okay. Yeah.
Well, no, this is the perfect. I wanted to jump in here because this is when you said a broken religion, restoring. This is the perfect segue into the next question. I actually asked you something pretty similar last time, and you gave a fascinating response. So, some time ago, Daniel asked. It was kind of a statement slash question, and he said, "I'm not saying that your model is wrong, but why could it be that they didn't follow the same model in the temple built by Solomon?" And then, of course, we see with the second temple, Herod's temple. So what is your response to the different temple with Solomon and then Herod's temple versus this dome structure in the wilderness?
I do not believe that Herod's temple and Solomon's, or dare I say David's temple, were the same. And I think that if you look at it, we'll just say Ezra's or Nehemiah. Nehemiah was kind of more building the wall, but the Zerubbabel. So Zerubbabel. Okay, so Zeru having to do with seed, and then Babel having to do with confusion. What happened when they returned to the land of Israel? Why did Nehemiah, he was like pretty perturbed. He says, like, half of these people are speaking the language of Ashdod. They'd all taken on foreign wives and everything. So it's like half of these people were not even Hebrew literate anymore. A lot of these exiles who returned. So what's going on there? What do you see going on? The young people are going, hip hip hooray! We've got the temple foundation. Oh, who gave them that orders for that temple? Oh, that was Cyrus. Who funded it? It was funded by foreigners, and the plans, the dimensions of it were given to a foreign king, a foreign pagan king who said, he was known for saying, there's a lot of people who think that he was operating under divine inspiration, but his point was like, I want you to go and pray to your God for the king and all of his sons and daughters and people and subjects. So was he a pantheist where he's like, okay, let's try all the gods and we'll try the Israel one too? I'm not going to make a strong case on that because I don't care that much. But getting into this idea that this design did not come from Yehudim, not from the returning Jewish exiles, and they were Jewish at that point. How many of them? 42,000? 42. We've seen that number before somewhere. So these are the people who are building, and specifically they're released back to the land so that what? So they could do sacrifice. And this notion that they built it according to the Cyrus plan, like as if it was better. But what did it say? Don't think of this as don't despise the day of small beginnings. And he said, well, the glory of this house will be greater than that of the former. It's like, why? Because if Messiah was walking in this in years to come, is that the glory of that house? Or is it the fact that they were running over the whole Trans-Euphrates region? They had command and sovereignty that was well beyond the borders of what is geographically is Israel at the time. So, what is that supremacy in a sense referring to? But what happened is the young ones said hip hip hooray, and the elders did what? They wept. Anyone who had been alive at the time of Solomon's temple, or again, I call it David's temple because David thought of it and he funded it. And it talks about how David got that plan, from the way that it's translated into English is like that the Spirit had put in his mind. But if you look at that in Hebrew, it really sounds like that David inferred it by deducing it from the scriptures, the Torah. So I think that David actually had one of these things when he built, when he's lamenting the fact and saying, "Oh, I'm living in a palace, and but the poor ark is sitting in just a tent." He's kind of lamenting because he's got all the money in the world. When I say all the money in the world, he had amassed like over $100 billion worth of gold. Okay, so he can pretty much do whatever he wants, and he's got all these foreign nations paying tribute to him and so forth and so on. So this is where Solomon got his bankroll from. It just came from Daddy, and so David's like, okay, well, I'm not going to build, but my son can. And so if you listen to what it all transpired, what did you have happen? He says, I am, when did I ever say to my people, people who shepherd my people Israel, to build me a house of cedar? It's like, David, this is your idea. This isn't the Almighty. He's like, well, okay, well, if this is what you really want to do, then do it. It's kind of, that's and it's a roundabout consent. It really wasn't. It wasn't a matter of divine preference to say let's replace the tabernacle with the temple, because what crept in at that point? Dispensationalism, and so people want to say, well, the temple is greater. The tabernacle we had for a while, and the temple is greater. And that was neat for the wilderness, but guess what? The tabernacle lived 100 or 480 years, outlasted the temples. First temple, second temple, outlasted each of those. And so to think of this as being an inferior desert structure and associated with with lament, this was associated with the days of the judges, where on one hand everyone did according to what they saw was right in their own eyes, but there's also a liberty and a freedom with that didn't last long after between David, Saul, David, and Solomon. Solomon is where it really went. The wheels fell off the cart, when he died young, and he had knucklehead son that was saying, well, we'll just tax these people to death, and so Judah took on too much ascendancy. So you have modern Jews just dreaming, say, oh, we want the temple, and this gets into eschatology. It's like, well, is this what we ought build as opposed to that? And when I say that, where did he ever say, I want a temple made of cedar? He didn't say that. It's never said that way. But we have very exacting dimensions. Build it like this, and then there's a record, and they built it like that, and make it according to the pattern shown in the mountain. What's the pattern in the mountain? Well, we've got this thing that sits on 10 pillars. 10 pillars, 10 commandments. What do we got? What should we want? Why did Solomon dismantle this? I think Solomon's a picture of Antichrist, to be honest, but with his income of 666 talents of gold and being, dressed in his splendor and so forth and so on, and, eventually taking on the foreign wives. So
you're not the only one I've heard that from. So to sum this up, it seems like this is an ongoing lesson in life that Yahuwah has given us our instructions, how he wants us to live, instructions in righteous living. We call that the Torah, the first 5 books, of course. I remember how Rob Skiba once phrased it. It's like if you go rent an apartment, you get a lease, you got this contract, and you got all the rules in there, and you sign it. And if you don't read it before you sign on to it, you might get in a hissy fit if the landlord comes and kicks you out or whatever. Some places it's a little bit harder. In California, I think you can legally squat in there for a couple of years, and not pay any rent. But whatever, you get the point. It's like he's got these instructions in there. This is what I want. And nobody seems to think. I mean, you have an excellent point. Everyone's like, I can't wait for the third temple. It's not just the Jews, the Christians as well, right? They're like, I can't wait for the third temple. It's going to happen, and it's like, well, but we've got the instructions right here. This is what he wants, right? Why not just build the tabernacle? So that's a question I had for years. Why, if they have the tabernacle, why did they switch to the temple? Where are those instructions? It's not, anyways. Now, this is probably as good a time as any to kind of close shop. Is there? We've been going for 2 hours now at this point. Is there anything else you wanted to? And Daniel, thanks you for the answer for giving that. Is there anything else you wanted to add before we close workshop for the night?
Sure. I guess I'll just replug project314.org. That's the website, and my email's on there, and phone and so forth, contact info. We also have getting into the books, the Peshat. So, I have everyone, jumping up and down and saying, "Oh, look, it's the firmament," and they're looking at this from a distance. And getting into the idea of korban in Hebrew has to do with this is where we get karav magah, right? This is the close touch, So karav, who wants to draw near, So drawing near to the tabernacle, I think, is what we should be thinking in terms of. And getting into, we want to restore the feasts. What about restoring the place where he puts his name? And everyone thinks it's like Jerusalem. There's no mention of Jerusalem in the Torah. As far as, but there is this place, and that place, again, in the center, he's like, I will dwell in their midst. But toch is the Hebrew on that, referring to this thing, because he is in the center of it, and they're all around it. So the idea of restoring, everyone wants to say, I keep the feast, I've returned to, I'm going back to the ancient paths and ways, and it's like, but everyone argues about Leviticus 23, but really hasn't given Exodus 26 its fair shake. And so getting into, again, restoring the name, restoring the presence, restoring the identity, the reputation. I think this is key in a lot of these things, restoring understanding. And so I do have, again, books on my website and on Amazon. I got workbook, PowerPoint. I have hardcover, softcover, books where I'm very, very thorough on all these details. So everyone's thinking, it's like, if you have no understanding, you have no witness, and people say, well, I think it is because I heard this guy, he's an engineer and he knows this stuff or whatever, and it sounded really convincing. But without a grassroots, with a knowledge base in this is what I need. This is what I think that we need to help restore this, because restoring this, there's so many dimensions to, truth. This is a, when I say a religious revolution, in my opinion, waiting to happen. And the same way that the exiles came back, it's like, well, what they did is they built their own houses with the supplies they got from Cyrus. It's like, that was kind of first they built an altar, they sacrificed, and it's like, well, let's build our houses. And it's like, well, then in between building the wall and when did they really complete the temple? It's like, what do we put into our own houses relative to the house of the Almighty here? So again, I think it's fitting to be speaking of this in the 9th of Av, and so I'm looking for, I have a webinar again. I'm looking to probably run that again. I might do that kind of soon. But I have recordings that you can get on my website on that. And so just, again, financial support, assuming we're, I'd like to go forward and move, start up a larger building project. It takes a number of things to make that happen, as far as people and, when I say people, woodworking types and I could do it with one other guy that I've been working with a little bit. But there's no shortage for skilled. It's like, the fact that I have multiple, skills and capacities doesn't make me proficient by any stretch of any stretch of the imagination. It's like, okay, I can fumble through this and make it, but it'll take me 6 times longer than anyone else. So, looking for, people to help facilitate this next build and just present ongoing, operations and things. This is a lot of time to put the research together, to put slides together, to put I've got again some of this teaching content that I haven't released to John Q. Public and everyone in the because there's some, as far as drawing near, if the idea of sacrifice is abhorrent to you, then why would you want to see a tabernacle? Why would you, but it's like he says to Solomon, after Solomon says, hey, I've got this grandiose place, and when your people sin, may they return and pray towards this place. And if you see that phrase again and again, and they pray towards this place, but the response that Solomon gets, he says, I have heard your prayer, and I've accepted this as a place for sacrifice. And so, we think of it as, the temple is a house of prayer for all nations. And it's like, well, that's true, and that's part of Solomon's thing. But praying towards the place, it was never a prayer antenna or magnet, and it's the idea of praying to the one who is, theoretically occupying this place. And so, people build churches and all that. The churches are what? They're for housing the people. This was always for housing. The presence of the Almighty. This was his thing.
So someone asked, Jody asked the name of your website, and it's Project 314. That's where people
.org.
.org. That's where you guys can go get in contact with Andrew to volunteer your help, your time, your talents, as well as help support financially, physically, financially his ministry, and to get this project going. And one thing that in the several phone conversations I've had with Andrew Hoy, and one of the themes that comes across a lot is kind of what he just insinuated, was this idea that, well, I'll say it from my perspective, because I grew up, in the eschatological worldview of Christianity, where everyone's really anticipating this, this third temple, and they're so excited by this idea that, in their lifetime the temple might be built. But it's like, how many of those people are actually interested in, like, as Andrew says, they see it from afar. Right? He said, I think you said like 10 minutes ago that they see it from afar and see the firmament or something like that. But how many people actually want to go into it and sacrifice and actually get closer to the Most High and live a set apart life? Right? That's where people start to like kind of drift off. Like, they're not interested in that. They're just interested in the idea, but not actually what it's the purpose of it, which is to walk the narrow path, live a set-apart life, get closer to the Most High in a very holy, sacred place. And that's where, of course, the road gets narrower and narrower and more densely populated, obviously. So I appreciate you, Andrew, coming on, and this went way better tonight than last time. This is how it should go every week. And so I appreciate your willingness to come back and your patience and obviously, so thank you for that. And we're going to close. We're going to close tonight's Shalom for the last time, everybody. We're going to reconvene over in the general voice chat. You guys can come over there, and you guys can all talk with Andrew, and he could answer all of your questions. And of course, you can stay, or you could, as long as you want, Andrew, you can leave. Whatever you'd like. That. Good night, everybody. All right.
Good night. Thanks much, Noel, for hosting me, and thanks for everyone for listening and considering different perspective on this thing here.